Swedish Perspective. And our guest, the ambassador, has been in the United States for 4.5 years, having first been here in 1953 when his father was stationed to the embassy. And among other things, he worked on a farm in Ohio, which is a nice American experience. He's a graduate of Stockholm University, Bachelor of Arts degree in law. He joined the Foreign Service in 1960. His early postings were to Japan and the Federal Republic of Germany. His specializations within the Foreign Ministry were disarmament, arms control, security affairs, and atomic energy matters. He also, for a while, was head of the North American section of the Foreign Ministry. Prior to becoming ambassador here, he was posted as ambassador to Turkey, where he met his wife. He was posted as ambassador to the German Federal Republic. That's not true, the German Democratic Republic. And during the waning days of that particular regime, a very, very interesting period, which the ambassador remarked seems as if it was an eternity ago. And indeed, for many of us, it is amazing how the Cold War has receded from our memories. And then he was posted in Brussels, where, of course, he reported on European affairs in that very interesting first years of the post-Cold War era. He's been here for 4.5 years and will be leaving this summer. He's attained quite a reputation for his diplomatic skills. I noted the Washington Post said that he and his wife have hosted an average of, or entertained an average of 20,000 people at the Swedish embassy every year, which may not be a record, but it's very, very impressive indeed. And he's been very helpful in the American community, working with over 21 charity causes, both locally and nationally. Apparently, it's the Swedish tradition to grant an ambassador his choice of final posts after being in Washington, and so he'll be apparently going to Istanbul, which is his wife's home city, and then will be posted as ambassador in Ankara following time in Istanbul. We always think of our senior European friends as witty, charming, and full of wisdom. I promised not to give a long introduction so that one doesn't have to try to live up to everything that is said. I merely give that short summary, which he has to live up to. My pleasure to present to you the Ambassador of Sweden to the United States, His Excellency Henrik Liljegren.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. It is always difficult to live up to these long curricula vitae and nice things that have been said about you by very kind people. Washington Post had it right on many things. The numbers were not that impressive. Actually, we've had about 4,000 or 5,000 people every year. So in 4.5 years, we've probably had 20,000 people at home. And it's correct that we are heading back, probably, no official decision has been taken, to Turkey. And that would be very much in as we have wished it, because we started out there. My wife is Turkish. We are very fond of Turkey. I think it's a very fascinating nation and a great people. So I hope that Washington Post is right about that. It's a pleasure to be here in Baltimore and to be able to look out over the Oriole Park and this magnificent view of the harbor and the very many friendly faces that I see here tonight. It's a great honor to be invited by the Baltimore Foreign Affairs Council, and it's intimidating, but I will try anyway to speak before this very distinguished audience. The title, which I was asked about the title, and I said the Swedish Perspective, because that could be just anything, and I would be able at the last moment to figure out something to say. I will be a little selective, but I'll try to give a perspective of past Swedish foreign policy and present Swedish foreign policy. And to illustrate my point, I will start by telling the story of a visit by Dr. Kissinger up north a few years ago. It was, let's say it was Sweden, because this story is probably not quite true, but anyway, the foreign minister was a little nervous because he didn't speak English. So, but his staff calmed him down and said, "Don't worry, you just meet him at the airport and you say, welcome, how are you?" And that's it. So he proceeded to the airport, and there was Dr. Kissinger stepping out of the plane, and the foreign minister said, "Welcome." And then they proceeded to the car and towards the capital. And during this trip, the foreign minister felt a little uneasy. He felt he had to say something more. So he tried to remember what the staff had told him. And then he turned to Dr. Kissinger and said, "Who are you?" Well, probably the first time that happened to Dr. Kissinger. He was not a frequent flyer to the north in the past. Actually, our relations, Sweden and the United States, were of a friendly but somewhat distant character. And why is that? Well, we were talking about that before. Things looked very different in those days before '89. Before '89, the Swedish relationship with and attitude towards the European Union, NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the United States was influenced by the fact that Sweden pursued a policy of neutrality. The correct definition was given in this paper. I was very impressed by this, and that was non-alignment in peacetime, aiming at neutrality in case of war. This was an old policy, actually ancient already, and we had pursued it since 1814. Our last war was a war against the Norwegians. You haven't had the Norwegian ambassador here yet. He'll give you his version of that. It's probably one of the reasons why Norway didn't want to join the European Union. That word union sort of reminded them of bad old times. Well, we were neutral in 2 world wars. Why did we continue after the Second World War? The reason was basically strategic. Our policy of neutrality combined with a strong defense was our contribution to strategic stability in the Nordic area. This area, by the way, covers a territory as big as the United Germany, France, and Great Britain together. The so-called Nordic security pattern meant that the 2 alliances did not have to face each other eyeball to eyeball with huge standing forces as they did in Central Europe. On the other hand, it was inherent in the logic of the Nordic security pattern that any move towards the east by Western security structures, a word which is familiar from today's debate between Russia and NATO, could provoke a Soviet compensatory move against Finland, since in those days the Soviet Union claimed privileged Soviet interests in Finland. The many naval and air bases along the Baltic Sea was a constant reminder of the threat posed by our powerful but insecure and suspicious neighbor. Well, you can argue that things have not changed that much. We can come back to that in the Q&A session. The policy of neutrality that we pursued in the days of the Cold War meant that we had to be careful not to be seen to be too close to either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. It was very important that we maintained our credibility so that no one would think that we contemplated joining either the Warsaw Pact, and nobody dreamed of that anyway, or NATO. I remember being with my foreign minister in Moscow for a visit. It was one of those tough ones where we said very critical things of Soviet foreign policy, and they totally ignored it, of course. Gromyko came with us to the airport, and as a matter of protocol, he asked for a bottle of vodka and 2 glasses, and he wanted to toast my foreign minister. So Gromyko raised his glass, looked my foreign minister into the eyes and said, "Here is to down with NATO." I could see that my foreign minister for a split second hesitated, but he drank, and then he asked for another glass, and he said, "Mr. Gromyko, may I propose a toast? Down with the Warsaw Pact." And Gromyko had to drink to that. It happened. In those days, our foreign policy focused on support for United Nations, assistance to the Third World, or issues of democracy and human rights in the Third World, as well as on promoting confidence-building measures between East and West. There was also a tendency to be critical of the so-called 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, for the methods they employed in their global competition for allies and clients. We were very active in the field of disarmament, conventional as well as nuclear, and came up with many what we thought were constructive proposals at the disarmament conference in Geneva and in the United Nations. The Swedish people, like many other peoples in Europe, were very much concerned with the nuclear balance and the risk for a nuclear war which one feared could break out by mistake any moment. One applicant to the service of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, who had to write a thesis for the entrance examination, started his paper with the following ominous paragraph. "Last year, mankind was at the brink of disaster. This year, it has taken a big step forward." He passed because everybody felt that they knew what he meant. In the days of the Cold War, the importance of the United States was of an existential but rather indirect nature. The United States upheld the nuclear balance with the Soviet Union, deterring the Warsaw Pact from any temptation to advance its positions at the expense of the West. The nuclear umbrella of the United States provided protection not only for NATO allies, but in reality also for neighboring nations like Sweden. Sweden, for its part, made a contribution to transatlantic security by maintaining a relatively strong defense and by playing its specific role in the Nordic security pattern, which kept tension in the Nordic region low. To the west, we had Denmark and Norway, members of NATO, but without any troops or nuclear weapons in peacetime. To the east, we had Finland, neutral, but with a specific or special friendship pact with the Soviet Union, and we were neutral in the middle. After this revolutionary transformation of the international system, which took place 89 to 92, with the Berlin Wall coming down, the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and of the Soviet Union, of course, Swedish foreign policy underwent a radical change. Gone was the threat of a major nuclear war between the Western and Eastern blocs. Many other types of threats, however, appeared on the horizon. We knew what we left behind us, but not yet about the options for the future. That's why our parliament in the spring of '92 reformulated our security policy and said that our policy was to stay outside of military alliances in order to be able to be neutral in case of a war in our part of Europe. Thus, the status of being neutral became an option, among others, and not an automatic response on Sweden's part. This might not seem like a very radical change to you, but I can assure you, for the Swedish people, it felt kind of strange not to have a policy of neutrality 100%, but just this theoretical option, because this is something the Swedish people have lived with for more than 160 years. So things change slowly when it comes to the formulation of foreign policy, while in actual practice things move much faster. For instance, the difference between now and then is significant. We have now joined the European Union. We now cooperate extensively with NATO within the framework of Partnership for Peace. And Swedish soldiers have joined IFOR and SFOR, where we cooperate with the United States as well as with Russian troops. Our commitment to democracy and human rights everywhere in the world remains strong, but nowadays cooperation with the Baltic states on the other side of the Baltic Sea is one of our highest priorities. Also, our relationship with the United States has undergone far-reaching changes. Being the Swedish ambassador, I hope you will permit me to concentrate a little on the relations between the United States and Sweden nowadays. First of all, in the new security landscape emerging after the Cold War, the active foreign policy of the United States has influenced our region in a much more direct way than before. By supporting the forces of democracy and market economy in Russia, and by negotiating reductions and the elimination of nuclear weapons in Russia and the former Soviet republics, the United States has helped improve Nordic security environment greatly. However, recent high-level American activities have had an even more direct effect on the Nordic region. I'm thinking of President Clinton's personal involvement in the issue of Russian troop withdrawal from the Baltic nations. President Clinton had several talks with President Yeltsin in 1993 and 1994, encouraging him to fulfill an earlier Russian promise to withdraw the Russian troops from the sovereign territories of the Baltic states. The complete withdrawal of the troops finally took place in August 1994 and constituted the single most important improvement in Swedish security in recent years. Had the American diplomacy not been so active and conducted at such a high level, the troops might still be there. Only half a year after the withdrawal, many statements coming out of Moscow sounded quite anti-Baltic, to put it very mildly. Thus, Sweden has good reasons to be grateful to the United States, to which it in no small measure owes its present favorable position. I'm sorry, I'm getting papers stuck to each other. It's the rain on the way here. The role of the Swedish government, led by then Prime Minister Carl Bildt, was also significant. As a matter of fact, the active diplomacy on the part of the Swedish government, both in the Baltic capitals and in Moscow, contributed to the successful outcome of the crucial talks between President Clinton and President Yeltsin. It's also been pointed out that the Swedish government was instrumental in initially drawing the urgency of the troop withdrawal matter to the attention of the White House. In his State of the Union message on February 5, the President said that the first task for the new administration would be to help to build, for the very first time, an undivided democratic Europe. To this end, the administration has outlined a broad strategy in which the enlargement of NATO plays a major role. As the administration sees it, the enlargement of NATO should help the United States and Europe erase outdated Cold War lines and strengthen security for everybody. Another major element of this broad strategy is to build a strategic partnership with Russia. To achieve this broad objective is not an easy undertaking. Many Russian leaders, including President Yeltsin, opposed the enlargement of NATO in principle, as we could see at the Helsinki meeting. while the countries that know that they are not going to be included in the first tranche of new NATO members are concerned that they will be relegated to a gray zone between Russia and the West, a zone that Russia might be tempted to think of as a Russian sphere of interest. Russian behavior towards the Baltic countries lately has only served to reinforce their apprehension in this respect. It will be interesting to know what the next speaker will say about this subject. I won't be here to hear it. In view of these circumstances, it's obvious that it will be a very challenging diplomatic and political task for the United States to ensure that none of the Baltic nations feels itself consigned for the foreseeable future to a zone of lesser security. Sweden, for its part, will continue its efforts to improve relations between Russia and the Baltic states, to increase economic and cultural relations between all countries in the Baltic Sea area, and to bring the Balts closer to EU membership. Actually, the whole Swedish nation, that is, Swedish industry, Swedish provincial authorities, non-governmental as well as governmental organizations, are engaged in endeavors which we hope will enhance the prosperity of our neighbors along the Baltic Sea coast as well as our own. Against this background, it should come as no surprise that the main topic of discussion between President Clinton and Prime Minister Persson when he visited Washington in August last year was how our two countries could best bolster the sovereignty of the Baltic nations. This will probably continue to be the most important item on the agenda between the United States and Sweden in the years to come. Our membership of the European Union, our participation in peacekeeping activities in former Yugoslavia, together with US and Russian troops, and our current status as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, I think provide further reasons for an intensified dialogue between the United States and Sweden. In this way, the United States and Sweden have become truly interdependent partners for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that, I think, interesting overview of Sweden's perspective, past and present. Also for correcting me on my quotes of the Washington Post and letting everyone know here that the Washington Post is not always absolutely accurate. The floor is now open for questions. The question is, what is the future of the democratic socialist ideal in a world which seems to be emulating the practices of the United States?
Well, you're correct in asking me about that, because Sweden was well known for its social welfare and for its emphasis on social democracy. This is a model which is the object of strains, of course, in the current economic situation. So far, it seems that the Swedish government and the Swedish people wish to retain as much as possible of the old welfare system, including paying rather high taxes for it. How long that will last, nobody knows. What the government is trying to do is to combine economic development, to speed up economic development and to restructure labor market at the same time as it keeps basic social, well, welfare is perhaps a word which leads you in the wrong direction. It's, we could call it social assistance rather. The basic solidarity between those who don't have anything and those who have a little more is something which is an underlying assumption in the Swedish society so far. We are not the only ones to struggle with this dilemma. The same thing happens in other European countries, and I think your question will loom large over the horizon for many years to come.
What is Sweden's position, if any, on EU expansion into the Baltics?
Thank you for that question, because that is a high priority for us. We are really fighting for membership of the Baltic nations. We want to have them lined up at the starting point for the next enlargement tranche. And we can see that at least one of the Baltic states would fulfill the criteria which have been formulated by the European Union for membership. And it would be tragic if both NATO and the European Union said no to the Baltic states because of geopolitical circumstances which have nothing to do with the criteria which EU has formulated for membership in the European Union.
Would you comment about world situation in Turkey and its environs?
Well, it's an interesting drama that is being played, where several nations and population groups are involved. You have Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. And on Cyprus you have two communities, the Turkish Cypriot community in the north and the Greek Cypriot community in Nicosia and the south. The European Union now is considering whether to admit Cyprus as a member or not. Turkey wants to become a member of the European Union. The European Union has said that, well, we don't know about this because the criteria for membership are so difficult and you have not advanced far enough on human rights, on democracy, on market economy, and so on and so forth. Of course, it would be an advantage probably to Turkey if at least Cyprus and the Turkish Cypriot community could become members. However, Greece is posing problems in this respect, and the Greek Cypriot community is not very happy, enthusiastic about the idea of having to consult with the Turkish Cypriot community. So this seems like a very difficult problem where we need to cooperate. The United States needs to cooperate with the European Union. The European Union has a leverage because Turkey wants to become a member, because Cyprus wants to become a member, and the United States has a certain amount of leverage on Turkey because of the military assistance. On the other hand, very important interest groups in Congress are trying to prevent Turkey from obtaining military assistance, which reduces the influence of the United States. So you can see that this is a dream for any diplomat to be dealing with all these factors which seem to contradict each other. I've seen in the papers that the United States, the administration is going to nominate a mediator, or at least a diplomat who will be busy with, concerned with this particular drama. And one has also said that 1997 would be the year of Cyprus, because Cyprus, in a way, is the key to the solution. And I could go on for 45 minutes more, but I think that I should stop here, especially since I'm not nominated to become either this or that in Turkey right now. Thank you.
Given, excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, given Sweden's long interest in Ethiopia, would you comment upon the variety of ethnic groups presently not represented in the government of Ethiopia?
Could I ask what specifically you are wondering about in our policy there?
The questioner clearly has the opinion that there are certain large ethnic groups within Ethiopia who are not properly represented by their government, have no voice in talking to the United States and other nations. What is Sweden's position about that circumstance?
Not knowing a thing about this, I would answer that we generally support democratic forces everywhere who strive to obtain democracy by peaceful means.
Would you comment about your country's strength of feelings with respect to the European Union, given public opinion in Sweden not being totally enthusiastic, a modest vote of approval going into EU, and Norway's decision not to go in?
Well, thank you for that question. It's very pertinent. There is a sort of paradox between the fact that the government is pursuing our membership and our interest within the EU with a great vigor, while the public, on the other hand, thinks that the EU stinks. But I think that's a natural reaction after. It was an enormous psychological effort on the part of the politicians and the Swedish people to contemplate joining something outside Sweden. Think of it, we've been alone, isolated in a way, and sui generis for so many years, and now we were asked to join something bigger and far away, and there were Catholics and very conservative forces down in Europe, and one would never, know us Lutherans how we would be able to deal with that. But we will overcome, I think, eventually. And we regret very much that the European Union doesn't include Norway. We're trying to sort of keep in touch with the Norwegians. They used to give us very good briefings on NATO, and they still do, actually. And we can, for once, tell them something, which is about what's happening within the European Union. But I think they will join one day. It's better to be inside, the famous, was it Eisenhower? Anyway, I will not quote him. Thank you.
What are your most important industries using some percentages?
Well, I think if I really put it in broad terms, the export industry is absolutely vital to our nation. Half of our industry is dealing with exports. And for an American, it might be interesting to know that Absolute Vodka is a Swedish product. And it happens to be the largest in volume of all our export products to the United States. And Volvo and Saab are not American. They are nowadays half American, actually, but they started out as purely Swedish products, and there are many other products. So our export industry, especially vehicles, I think that's our strongest point.
Given you're opening a consulate here in Baltimore recently, would you describe your depth of interest in Baltimore and hopes for this trade with Baltimore?
Well, I can tell you as an illustration of a trend that the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce in Washington has tried to expand to Baltimore because of its very interesting opportunities for Swedish industry. There was a meeting in this house, I think a month or two ago. Were you there, perhaps? No. Anyway, so we are discovering Baltimore, or rediscovering to some extent, and you'll see Swedish Americans all over the place in the future.
Two questions. First of all, do you have any problems with immigration and with foreign workers? And secondly, what is your policy with respect to gaining exports to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union?
As regards illegal immigration from the former Soviet Union, we have had some problems because the borders are not quite well guarded in some of the Baltic nations. We are actually trying to help them with their border security. But this is not an enormous problem in any way. We have received very many refugees from Bosnia. I think 1% of the Swedish population right now is Bosnian. So we have a fairly liberal policy of asylum and refugees. When it comes to trade and investment in Russia, this is part of a grand strategy that we have, trying to promote trade between northwestern Russia, St. Petersburg, and the West, and between northwestern Russia and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And we also interested in stimulating trade with Poland and, of course, Germany, the whole Baltic region. And this is self-interest. We think this is a fantastic area for trade expansion. We think that the economic growth will be 6, 7, 8% in the future. And we think that it would be good for Swedish companies to hitch on to this development and to be part of the picture. And it's good for political stability as well. So your question, I think, was very well formulated.
Would you comment upon inflation and aging?
Inflation is going down and age is going up. It's my birthday today, and you reminded me of it. Thank you. It's less than 2% and going down. I mean, it's fantastic. We never had it that way. On the other hand, unfortunately, unemployment is very high, and it's never been as high as now. So we have to deal with that. That's our major problem.
How excellent is medical care in Sweden?
It's a mixed picture. It's been disastrous for some time, and then measures were taken to really rationalize things. We had long queues for any kind of operation. And then somebody had the brilliant idea of just asking the people, the patients, when do you want to be operated? And nobody wanted to be operated tomorrow. They all said, well, in a few months and so on. And all of a sudden, we had no queues to these operations. It's a question of money, of course, to some extent. But I think we are good at preventive care, and Swedish doctors are very good at asking the right questions, and they don't send you immediately to take x-rays or go through all sorts of machines that cost a lot of money. But they tell you very simple things. Instead of taking a pill, take a walk, things like that. It's improving, and in some areas we are quite good, you know.
Would you comment on Russian disposal of nuclear waste in the Arctic?
I think it's a pretty disastrous picture there as well, I'm afraid. We are joining forces with the Russians themselves to clean up things, and we're trying to see if we can do things together with many nations on a big scale to clean up after the Soviet era. There are nuclear reactors along the Baltic Sea coast which are not very safe. They are the type that we had some problems with Chernobyl, and we have to do something about it. And there are various fora for this. One is the Baltic Sea Cooperation Council, where Sweden is very active. We're trying to find a way of dealing with energy questions covering the whole region, and seeing whether we can, close down a few nuclear reactors and using other sorts of energy like gas and so on. But it's a tremendous problem. I was ambassador to East Germany. I saw how the Soviet army and the East German army used the soil, and it was destroyed for a generation or two. It's an enormous legacy that the Soviet Empire left after itself.
Would you comment upon education in Sweden?
It seems like a broad question to me, but it's not as expensive as in the United States, number one. Number two, it's not as elitist as in some other countries. We have problems in some areas. There are the usual complaints about the sloppiness of schools, high schools, and parents are not paying as much attention to their children as they perhaps should, and authorities are trying to find ways of dealing with all that. I can't say that we are a model for any other nation, but we are doing our best.
Given the high ranking that the embassy has gotten under your leadership. The question is for you to modestly let the world know how you've done it.
You know, Washington is very different from other capitals because you have this enthusiasm for fundraising in this country. You know, there's charity all the time, and if normally you would say, no, the embassy can't be involved in that. On the other hand, you meet the most interesting and important people that way, because the interesting and important people are all doing charity of some kind, or doing things for any noble cause you can think of. So if you want to be in, you play the game and enjoy it, and we did. Thank you.
There are 3 trustees seated within 15 feet of me, and I would hear about it if I did not note that among the many noble and worthy causes for which people raise money is the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. And they would want me to tell all of you to be as generous as you can when you receive correspondence from us. The ambassador and I both thank you for that question. Do you have many nuclear stations, generating stations? And in the non-nuclear area, do you use primarily oil or coal?
We've got 12 reactors, and per capita, I think we are using nuclear power more than many other nations. We are among the ones using nuclear power more than many other sources of energy. We don't use oil. We were looking for oil, and took us a long time. Then on the island of Gotland, we found 1 liter of oil. So we gave up. It's the Norwegians. They've got all the oil, and we congratulate them to that. And we want to buy gas from anybody who offers us gas. And there's a big discussion in Sweden right now, so you touched on a sensitive raw nerve again, about closing down the nuclear reactors. And the government has promised the center party, who doesn't like nuclear power, I don't know why, but anyway, they don't. And so the government has promised the center party, which is sort of a half coalition partner, that we will soon close down a reactor. And this has created an uproar within Swedish industry and among Swedish public opinion. So it will be very interesting to see what we do.
The question was that in the promotion of democracy, often overlooked is the difficulty of defining what democracy is and confusing it with other concepts such as capitalism. On that question, I think, of intellectual clarity, what is your view?
Well, Sweden has not managed to come up with a perfect definition of democracy, which might surprise you very much, but we haven't. We are just, like everybody else, groping for pragmatically to promote and strengthen those forces which we think are working for the good of society. And we are doing that in very practical ways. For instance, we have an organization which deals with elections. And at the same time, we say we know that elections are not the panacea for democracy. But it's good if they are fair, and therefore we are sending observers everywhere on Earth, observing elections and making reports. And that has become an activity which has been broadened and which didn't exist really before, in that form at least. I think I should stop there.
Could you describe your policy on foreign language for residents?
Right. We have, I think, a very liberal view on that. We think that every foreigner should have the right to be educated in his own language. So we have very many language teachers, many languages, and it's confusing to many that we have this philosophy. The basic tenet is that people should be able to retain their cultural identity they should not be forced to integrate 100%, even if we are, flattered and pleased if foreigners speak Swedish. Thank you.
How powerful are the labor unions in Sweden?
They have been very, very powerful. And the best thing you can say about this is that our labor market is very peaceful. And when people are deciding whether to invest in Sweden, they often note that they will not risk disturbances, strikes, and conflicts, because relations between labor and management are quite good. And this is a Swedish tradition of compromise. It still stands. I hope that there is not a major strike tomorrow in Sweden.
You've been invited to compare the strength of family in Sweden with the strength of family in the United States.
I wouldn't dare to make any comparisons. The only thing I can say is that the dilemma or the differences that you are describing have existed in Sweden, and people have felt that for a long time families have not been kept together because it wasn't necessary to take care of the old and dear ones because the government took care of them. Now the government is saying that, well, it's better if the family takes care of more than we do in the future, and so on. The trend is going back towards the families where the people of working age are taking care of those who are retired. I was in Sweden a few weeks ago, and I was struck by the fact that we have one thing that really seems to work very well, and that is a community service for people who are over 65 and who start to have difficulties in walking or seeing or managing in general. And this service, youngsters appear and help the old people with their things and do it in a friendly and efficient manner, and it's really very nice to see that this functions. So there again, it's not the family, it's the community, and it's something that has been paid for by taxes. And of course the system is very different here, but basically the family as the core unit, I think more or less broadly we have the same philosophy as in the United States. I know there are differences within the states, but when it all comes down to the very basic thing, I think family is important, as important in Sweden as in the United States.
I simplified out of that question the word respect, and part of the question was the phenomenon of respect of a younger generation for an older generation. Would you comment upon the difficulty of that phenomenon, at least from the Swedish perspective?
Well, traditionally, in the Nordic countries, the old persons were very much respected. They were considered as the wise persons who would give guidance to the youngsters and the younger ones. I think trends have changed back and forth, but I think that's the basic trend and underlying trend in the Nordic countries.
The question is, why is your unemployment so high? What is the government doing about it? And is government assistance a problem in all of this?
Well, I don't think government assistance is a problem, really. Perhaps, yes, generous support for unemployed to some extent, but nobody wants to be unemployed just to, well, very few, I suppose, just to have subsidies, contributions by the government. No, it's the structure of the labor market, the fact that new jobs probably can only be created in the service sector. The service sector is a narrow sector. The incentives for private entrepreneurship could probably be improved, and as a representative of my Swedish government and the country as a whole. I mean, I can't enter into more detailed criticism of the present system. But I think generally the government is trying to find ways of dealing with it. I don't know if they're looking at the American experience, perhaps the British experience, but we need new ideas. The government has promised to halve unemployment until the year 2000. A very ambitious goal, and they are now starting a new program, putting a lot of money into creating new jobs and finding meaningful employment for people who are temporarily out of work. It's a big social experiment. The budget was presented just 2 days ago with a lot of details, and we are all trying to digest what is in this package from the government. Unemployment is the biggest problem for Sweden, and we are doing our utmost to get away from it.
Perhaps as a last question, you would comment. You earlier had said that you'd be very disappointed if the Baltic states did not become members of the European Union and NATO. Would you be satisfied if they became members of the European Union and not NATO?
Well, our basic idea is that it is up to the Baltic states themselves to decide whether they want to be members of NATO or not. As we are not members of NATO, we can't interfere in that debate. We can just generally support the Baltic states in whatever they choose as their security. As for European Union, we would really like to see 1 or 2 or 3 of the Baltic states become members as soon as possible. They deserve it, and it would promote trade tremendously. It would be good for Russia. It would be good for us. It would be good for everybody. And we are conducting very difficult, tricky negotiations and discussions with European nations who are not as convinced as we are, or not as concerned, or not as interested as we are in this problem. There are other nations which have their attention directed towards the south, and they don't understand what all this fuss is about the Baltics. We know, and we continue our struggle to support the Balts.
You certainly have shared with us, I think, a wonderful overview of Sweden and a lot of insight into the dynamics of your country, as well as providing us with an evening that has been most enjoyable. Thank you very much.